The Five Nights at Freddy's franchise now has a total of 11 different games that create a deep and complex story, and within that story there are many mysteries that remain unsolved to this day. The franchise is known for having iconic mysteries that have remained unsolved for almost 10 years, and 3 of these unsolved mysteries stand out as some of the most complicated and prominent mysteries from the entire series. There are countless theories on all of these mysteries, and in one of my last videos I combined solving 3 of the most popular mysteries from the franchise into one video. And in this video I'm going to combine 3 more of the most popular theories from the franchise, and I'm going to finally solve them definitively. So in this video, I'm going to solve the Nightmare Staff Bots in Fnaf Security Breach, Old Man Consequences in Fnaf Into the Pit, and finally I'm going to attempt to solve the Fnaf Ruin endings. So starting with the Nightmare Yen bots from Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach, let's not only solve their role in this game, but let's also solve what they're supposed to represent. But first, let's go over the Nightmare Yen staff bots that are also known as the Alpha bots. Let's go over everything we know about them for certain and every single appearance they've had in these new Fnaf games. The Alpha bots are older versions of the normal staff bots that are obviously designed to look similar to Nightmare Yen from Five Nights at Freddy's 4. Their eyes are painted black with white pupils, they have large black tears, a large black smile with pointy white teeth, and again it's obvious that their faces are supposed to be a direct resemblance to Nightmare Yen. And even their jump scares sound identical. He shares the same eyes and smiles that all Nightmare staff bots have, but most importantly, on the chest of these bots, it's written "in your dreams," but I'll get back to what this means later in the video. But now I want to focus on Nightmare Yen and why he's so important in not just this game, but in the franchise as a whole. He first appeared in the Five Nights at Freddy's 4 Halloween DLC update, but the contents of this DLC aren't canon to the franchise, meaning neither was Nightmare Yen. But then all of a sudden he appeared in Fnaf Ultimate Custom Night, which is canon to the franchise, and not only is he in this game, but he was actually the face of this game, as Nightmare Yen is the icon for Ultimate Custom Night, as he was now canon. Then he had a small appearance in Fnaf Help Wanted where he showed up in one of the minigames, and then he had a crucial role in Security Breach through the Alpha bots, but there's even more. In the sewer areas where we first find these staff bots, there is also this sticky note room that was filled with lore. There are countless videos and theories made on the sticky note room, but what I want to focus on are the Alpha bot heads that are scattered around this room. It's another way Nightmare Yen returns, and like the "in your dreams" line, I'll get back to the heads soon in the video. Throughout the Pizzaplex, we can also find these Nightmare Yen plushies scattered around the Pizzaplex, but it's impossible to find them when playing as Gregory. They are always out of the player's sight, and the only way to find them is when looking in an open camera view, when you can fly around the Pizzaplex freely, insinuating that these were purposely meant to be hidden for a very specific purpose. Throughout the Pizzaplex, we can also find these wires that are colored the same as Nightmare Yen. They are colored black and white, but it's never revealed what the purpose was of these wires. But again, it's just important to note that these also resemble Nightmare Yen's design. And finally, there's also this hidden room with a golden present in the center of it, and when opening it, you'll receive none other than a Nightmare Yen plushie. Then, after opening the present, an endoskeleton then activates behind it and begins to chase you, which feels important. But now that we've gone over Nightmare Yen in Security Breach and in past Fnaf games, let's look at his appearance in Ruin and in Help Wanted 2. In Ruin, we find the same plushies from Security Breach that are also hidden from the player or Cassie, but we don't actually find the Nightmare Yen staff bots anywhere, as they have a much bigger role in Help Wanted 2. In this game, not only do we find them in the Fizzy Faz minigame, but we also find them in the ending. After the player collects all Fast Force action figures, a charging station appears in front of you. Then Glitchtrap's hand peers out grabbing the door before he disappears, and Nightmare staff bots appear in front of you. The bots then get closer and grab you, which leads to a cutscene from Ruin where Cassie first finds the Vanny mask, but this time in the perspective of the staff bot that hands Cassie the Vanny mask. So again, it's clear that the Nightmare staff bots played a major role in this ending. And like Security Breach and Ruin, we also find Nightmare Yen plushies in the menu area, but this time they are visible to the player. Not only do we find them in the menu area, but we also find them in the virtual world, and more specifically inside the Princess Quest minigame, meaning these plushies exist in the real and virtual world. Now I know that's a lot, and there's even more questions that emerge with each appearance of these staff bots or Nightmare Yen, but there are a set of questions that I think if we answer correctly, we can solve these alpha bots and this character. With those questions being, why Nightmare Yen? Why are there heads in this room? What does "in your dreams" mean? Why are there plushies in all of these games that are hidden? Why are they in Princess Quest? Why do the Nightmare staff bots show up in this minigame and in the ending for Help Wanted 2? And finally, will they show up again? Again, these are a lot of questions, but I'm going to answer all of them in this video to finally solve the Nightmarian bots. But before we can even start to answer these questions, what do we know for certain about these staff bots? Well, in the Disassemble Freddy ending, we see that Vanny can control the staff bots using this button. She controls normal staff bots to push Freddy off a ledge, and she also controls the alpha bots to disassemble Freddy. Gregory later uses that same button to disassemble Vanny using normal staff bots, but again it's clear that Vanny can control all staff bots including the alpha bots. But we know it isn't actually Vanny controlling them, it's the glitch trap virus. In Fnaf AR and Help Wanted, we learned that a virus was taking control of systems, causing them to shut down, and this virus eventually took the mind of Vanessa, causing her to become Vanny. Then the virus, with the help of Vanny, took control over the entire Pizzaplex, which is why the virus has control over every single animatronic, including the staff bots. But who is the glitch trap virus? Well, we know that the glitch trap virus is actually the Mimic. We learned this from the Tales from the Pizzaplex novels, as we learned that the original Mimic 1 program that was developed to create the Mimic was brought back when a video game studio under Fazbear's Entertainment scanned an old circuit board while making a VR game, which then presumably caused the Mimic to return as Glitch Trap. Because this program was fed so much data from the pizzerias and company to create this VR game, the Mimic adapted to copy William Afton and his actions. So this means that it's actually the Mimic who is controlling the Nightmare staff bots, which leads us to our first question, White Nightmarian. Thinking about it logically, the Mimic made Vanny go out of her way to go to the sewers to find staff bots and made her paint their eyes, tears, smile, and add the quote "in your dreams" onto their chest. But why? Why would the Mimic want to change the design of staff bots to resemble an animatronic, and why Nightmarian? Well, to answer this, we need to look at Ultimate Custom Night and Help Wanted. Like I mentioned, in order to create the VR game, the Mimic 1 program was fed a bunch of data from Fazbear's Entertainment, and this included the knowledge and existence of Nightmarian. He was featured in one of the minigames, meaning he was a part of the data given to the Mimic program, meaning that the Mimic knew of Nightmarian and more specifically what he stood for. And when looking at a deathline from Ultimate Custom Night, what Nightmarian stood for and represented is exactly what the Mimic stands for and still represents. Take a listen.
I am the fearful reflection of what you have created.
I am the fearful reflection of what you have created. This is referring to William Afton and his creations, specifically how they have all led to sadness and pain. And this also applies to the Mimic and his creator, Edwin. In the novels, we learn that Edwin created the Mimic for his son, David. But after David was killed, Edwin beat and destroyed the Mimic while passing his agony onto him, which led to the Mimic becoming possessed and rageful. So the Mimic is a reflection of Edwin's actions and what he had created, and a very fearful one at that, as the Mimic went on to murder many innocent people. And again, this was all a result of Edwin's failed creation. So if the Mimic was going to choose someone or something to represent him in the physical world, then it makes perfect sense that he would choose Nightmarian, who perfectly represented his past and purpose. We know that the Mimic chooses William Afton or Spring Bonnie as the form he would show himself in the virtual world, and every time we see the Mimic in the virtual world, he shows himself as Glitch Trap and again Spring Bonnie. But I think that in the physical world, he chose to represent himself as something different, as something more terrifying, as Nightmarian. That's why we see the staff bot's design resemble Nightmarian. It's the Mimic trying to make himself present in the real and physical world. And as the game progresses, the Mimic's presence in the Pizzaplex only gets stronger, as after 6 AM and after Gregory decides to stay in the Pizzaplex, all staff bots are replaced by alpha bots. And again, this is the Mimic's control and presence getting stronger, and again he chose Nightmarian because this entity represents him and his purpose of being a failed creation that has only led to sadness and death. So now that we know why the Mimic chose Nightmarian and that he controls the Pizzaplex, this alone answers the plushies and wires. The wires are the Mimic's physical control over the Pizzaplex. It's the virus implementing itself in the Pizzaplex through the form of Nightmarian wires. The wires could have been any color or shape, but the virus or Mimic decided to use puppet wiring, as again that's how it wants to represent itself. And the Nightmarian plushies that are found in Security Breach, Ruin, and Help Wanted 2 are all ways that the Mimic is watching us. That's why they're always hidden in plain sight. It's the Mimic watching us without us knowing, and instead of using regular cameras or even the staff bots, there are Nightmarian plushies that again represent the Mimic and his purpose. So although they look like plushies, we can instead assume that they're cameras used to watch us, designed and placed in certain places by the Mimic or by Vanny. And this would also perfectly explain the plushies in the virtual world or in the Princess Quest minigame. The Mimic is also a virus that has implemented itself in the virtual world and in Princess Quest. So of course the Mimic would have a way to watch us and monitor us, which again is through these Nightmarian plushies. And now we can also start to answer the Nightmare staff bots in Help Wanted 2, starting fighting with Fizzy Faznight. Now this is actually their only appearance that I believe doesn't have lore or importance to it. Even when breaking down the minigame or what it means, the Nightmare staff bots are simply there as something the player needs to avoid, and besides the Mimic being the one who designed them and influenced them, there isn't any lore here. So I want to focus on the ending, which is important. Like I mentioned, we saw the staff bots appear in the ending as they grab the player before fading to a cutscene, and using the same reasoning from the last point, it's clear that it's the Mimic controlling them. We even see Glitchtrap's hand peer out of the charging station before the bots appeared, insinuating that he was responsible for them showing up and capturing the player, who again we know is the Mimic. This is the Mimic sending his henchman, who in a way represents him, to capture the player and to obey him. So when the Mimic is freed in the ending, what better way to come back to the physical world than with the animatronics that he designed and influenced, the Nightmarian bots. So now all we really have left to answer are the quotes on the staff bot's chest, "in your dreams." Now immediately my first thought was Fnaf 4 and Dream Theory, where the contents of this game were just a dream including Nightmarian, but I couldn't find a connection between dreams and the Mimic, or even Fnaf 4 and the Mimic. So that's when I decided to look at the Ultimate Custom Night voice lines once again, and there are a few voice lines that are very similar. Take a listen.
This is a nightmare that you won't wake from. The nightmare is just beginning.
He keeps repeating the term nightmare and how it's something that William Afton will never wake up from and something that he can never escape. And we can apply the same concept and logic to Security Breach in every game that follows. All these new FNAF games take place in the Pizzaplex, and all games follow a similar format where the protagonist must complete an objective in order to escape. The nightmare is the Pizzaplex and being stuck there. The nightmare is the idea that the player will never be able to escape, and these nightmare staff bots are a perfect reminder of that. By having "in your dreams" written on their chest, they're reminding the player that they're stuck in a nightmare, and that their only real way to be free would be in their dreams. And it's the Mimic who wants to remind the player they're stuck in an endless nightmare, as that's what Nightmarian represented, who he now represents himself as. So "in your dreams" represents being trapped in a nightmare in the Pizzaplex. Now one question that I briefly skipped over are the heads in the sticky note room, and that's because the answer is simple. They serve the same purpose as any other nightmare staff bot. They are there for the player to find, to be reminded that they're in a nightmare. And it could even be another way the Mimic is watching us, but really no matter what the answer is, it doesn't change the main point that the Nightmarian bots represent Nightmarian, who is actually the Mimic representing himself as that. An entity that was made from a failed creation that only led to sadness and death, just like the Mimic. Moving on, let's look at one of the franchise's most mysterious characters, Old Man Consequences, and more specifically, let's look at his odd role in FNAF Into the Pit. But first, let's go over the quick history of this character. Old Man Consequences first made his appearance in FNAF World as a minor character. He was featured in a secret ending where the player would reach the end of the map and encounter this character fishing alone. He only has 2 pieces of dialogue, as all he says is, "I'm sorry to say that you have gone too deep into the code." And he also says, "There's no way back out. My name is Old Man Consequences. Come have a seat and let's fish for a while. You have nowhere else to go." Old Man Consequences then made his next appearance in FNAF Ultimate Custom Night. To get that Easter egg, this player must set all animatronics to a rating of 0 and only keep Old Man Consequences at 1. Then when you're in the game and when you press a button to catch the fish, you will be taken to the Easter egg. Here you get the same exact screen as the one from FNAF World, but this time Old Man Consequences has very cryptic and confusing dialogue. He first says, "Come and sit with me a while." He then says, "Leave the demon to his demons, rest your own soul, there's nothing else." After this, the player then walks into the lake, drowning themselves, and this is where the Easter egg ends. And finally, in FNAF Op 1 and 2, we see Old Man Consequences return in the form of the Old King. He's the one who trades the player the Vanny mask for this Glitchtrap plush, and it's this plushie that Vanny destroys, signifying that she frees herself from the virus's control and is no longer under Glitchtrap's influence. But without Old Man Consequences' help, Vanny wouldn't have been able to free herself, and it feels like his purpose is to help those who are being tortured by William Afton like Cassidy. And like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, most recently we just saw Old Man Consequences in the newest game to the installment, Five Nights at Freddy's Into the Pit. When playing the Balloon Boy minigame where you play as Balloon Boy gathering different party hats, if you pushed against the left side of the third to last platform, you would phase into a secret area of the minigame. Here you witness the missing children incident as you see empty tables and chairs, then you see 5 balloons as you pop them, signifying the 5 children of the missing children incident. Then when you reach the end, you see Willie Mafton as Purple Guy who drops a 6th party hat, but you need to jump in time to collect it. But originally, there's going to be a 20% chance that you would instead encounter Old Man Consequences, who would tell you the following lines. You fell down the rabbit hole, didn't you? It's not your fault, you didn't know. The others didn't know either. You're a little different from them, you know? You're not trapped yet. Find solace in knowing such. Look to the sky or fall into the pit. The choice is yours. Although it's debated if cut content is canon or if it should be used to solve theories, in this context I think it's necessary as this small cutscene tells us so much about this character. So let's start to go over why this minigame solves the character of Old Man Consequences. With the 3 main quotes featured in this minigame, we also learn 3 new things or ideas revolving around this complex character. The first set of quotes focus on how the player got there and how he compares to other souls who have found him. With the use of rabbit hole, it feels like in order to reach Old Man Consequences, the player must go through extensive layers. Extensive layers of trauma and suffering. We know this is true as in Fnaf World, the player goes through different layers of code until they reach the very end where they find Old Man Consequences, and I think these layers of code represent suffering and trauma. And like he points out, the player in Fnaf World didn't mean to fall into the rabbit hole either. It's not clear where you are going as you pass the different layers. Even when you're right at the end, you don't know where you are until you find Old Man Consequences himself. Like the player from Into the Pit, these are 2 souls accidentally finding Old Man Consequences by going through different layers of pain and death. In Fnaf Into the Pit, they directly confirm this as the player goes through the missing children incident shown by the 5 balloons being popped. This minigame is directly showing us how a soul can reach Old Man Consequences and how it's not always intentional, but I'll get back to when it is intentional later in the video. This minigame is also showing us that every soul that reaches Old Man Consequences is connected in a way. That's why he even mentioned the other souls that have reached him, as again they're all connected. And when looking at the next set of quotes, they just prove this idea further. We also learn that the player is different from the other souls. He's not trapped yet and you should find peace in that. Now this is where I think Old Man Consequences mention another soul that we have seen in the franchise, Cassidy. Cassidy was the soul featured in FNAF Ultimate Custom Night, and I think this is the soul he's referring to as trapped. She is trapped in purgatory, that is an endless cycle where she tortures the man who murdered her, William Afton. She makes him face 50 of his creations for eternity, and again she's trapped in this cycle. So when Old Man Consequences is referring to the other soul that found him by accident, he's referring to the soul we play as in Fnaf World, but when he refers to the soul that is trapped, he's referring to Cassidy. And by mentioning Cassidy, he's again connecting all souls that have found him, and it's proving that time doesn't have a role with Old Man Consequences. Fnaf Into the Pit takes place in 1985, which would have been decades before Cassidy trapped William Afton in purgatory, but Old Man Consequences still mentions Cassidy, proving that time doesn't matter when reaching him. What matters is if you decide to stay in this rabbit hole, or if you even have the choice in leaving. In the same set of quotes, he tells the player to find solace in knowing he has a choice. Solace is defined as finding peace in distraught or difficult situations, so he wants the player to find peace even when he's traveled through layers of darkness and is essentially trapped. But this brings me to my next and last point, which is the idea of having a choice of continuing to be trapped or a choice of being free. With the past 2 souls who have visited Old Man Consequences, the first soul in Fnaf World did not have a choice of being free. Old Man Consequences directly tells them that they are trapped and that there's nowhere else to go. Although they reached this area by accident, it's clear that they still don't have a choice in leaving and that they are trapped. But with the second soul, Cassidy, she does have a choice to be free, as Old Man Consequences tells her to leave the demon to his demons, which is William Afton, and to rest your own soul. Now, although it isn't confirmed if Golden Freddy decides to rest, I think the Ultimate Custom Night ending tells us that her soul still hasn't been put to rest. We see Golden Freddy twitching uncontrollably, and we even see a dim light in her eyes, meaning she is still possessing this animatronic, and again her soul isn't resting. She is choosing to continue to torture William Afton instead of being set free, so although she has a choice, she is still trapped. But with the soul we see in Fnaf Into the Pit, we also learn that they have a choice. With the last set of quotes from Old Man Consequences, they read, "Look to the sky or fall into the pit. The choice is yours." Unlike the soul from Fnaf World, although the soul found this lake accidentally, they still have a choice in leaving or being free. And this choice is actually up to the player, with the first choice being falling into the pit. Old Man Consequences has the 6th and secret party hat to be collected, and if you try to collect the hat but miss, you will fall into the pit and the minigame will end. Which also means that you remain trapped, but if you grab the hat successfully and go back to the base minigame, you have the option of completing it normally but with the 6th hat. And when doing so, you will be awarded with the win screen, and as the player, you and their soul are now free. But finally, the last thing I want to point out is the very last piece of dialogue. It reads, "The choice is yours." Now, although this might seem like a very vague statement, it's actually something very similar to what we've heard another character from the franchise say as well. A character that is believed to actually be the same as Old Man Consequences, Henry Emily. In FNAF 6 and in the salvaging segment of the game, Henry Emily says this,
"And forfeit payment. Please make your choice now. You have chosen to proceed with the maintenance checklist."
Although they aren't the exact same piece of dialogue, they're still very similar, and this might be another way of connecting these two characters. And in general, the way these two characters speak are very similar, and again, it feels like this is on purpose to connect these two characters. So the FNAF Into the Pit Cup minigame that features Old Man Consequences tells us that souls can find him accidentally, they can become trapped in the lake with him, and finally, the souls will sometimes have a choice in leaving. In this cup minigame, I also confirm that Old Man Consequences is Henry Emily, but remember, this is just a theory. Moving on, let's look at FNAF Ruin and its endings. These endings have been the point of discussion ever since this game was released, and by solving these endings, we can also answer any questions about characters and animatronics. So let's finally solve every single Five Nights at Freddy's Ruin ending, starting with the bad ending. For a quick recap, in the bad ending, it's revealed that Gregory was not stuck in the Pizzaplex, and that it was instead the Mimic copying his voice to lure Cassie down to the sinkhole to set him free. But after Roxy rescues Cassie, the real Gregory contacts Cassie through the walkie-talkie and tells her to follow his instructions. After the Mimic defeats Roxy and begins to chase Cassie, Gregory gives her specific instructions on how to navigate her way through the caves and how to escape the Mimic. She is ultimately successful when she reaches the elevator, and there the real Gregory reaches out to her once more.
The Nexus security program was designed to keep it hidden, but you shut down the security, and now it's free. It's not your fault. I know you did it for me, to save me. But we can't risk being followed. I'm sorry.
Gregory? No!
Now at the surface, it seems like Gregory was the one to cut the elevator, but shortly after the DLC was released, the community was quick to point out that this was instead the Mimic. Whenever the subtitles in Ruin stack on top of one another, it signifies that two different people are talking at the same time. And this is exactly what we see happen right before Gregory tells Cassie that they can't risk being followed.
It's not your fault. I know you did it for me, to save me.
This means that two different Gregorys were talking at the same time, and it's believed that the second Gregory was the Mimic pretending to be him once more. Also meaning it was the Mimic who cut the elevator, making Cassie fall. But again, I personally believe this is wrong, and I'll get back to the caption soon, but for now I want to focus on the game as a whole. Although the Mimic is communicating with Cassie throughout the entire game using Gregory's voice, he's only talking to her using pieces of Gregory's voice that already exist. For example, when the Mimic first introduced himself, he uses the exact same line and stutters that Gregory uses when he's first inside Freddy's room.
Gregory? I'm Gregory.
Your guest profile is unknown to me. Who are you?
I'm Gregory.
Gregory.
And this is the same throughout most of the story. That's why it almost seems unnatural the way Gregory is speaking, since it's actually just different parts of sentences morphed together to create a new one. But when the real Gregory is talking, this isn't the case, and we actually hear new dialogue that wasn't in Security Breach.
Really, you.
I've been trying to reach you all night. I'm not at the pizza place. Something's trying to trick you.
It sounds natural when he talks, and I think it's obvious when the real Gregory is talking, and this includes right before the elevator is cut. This is all new dialogue that the Mimic would not be able to recreate, and even the way Gregory talks feels real, which brings me to my next point, which is sympathy. Why would the Mimic treat Cassie with sympathy and feel sorry for her? We hear Gregory tell Cassie how he knows that what she did was all for him and that he's sorry for her. Why would the Mimic say this and apologize to her? Why would he even talk to her at all if Cassie already knows she was being tricked and knows who he is? There's no reason to manipulate her anymore to get what he wants. He could have easily just cut the elevator if he wanted to without needing to say anything to her. Which also brings me to my next point, which is that it isn't confirmed if the Mimic can even control the elevator. Although it's believed that the Mimic and Helpy are the same thing, it's never been confirmed, and it could be very possible that these are two separate entities. Game theorists made a few theories that there are actually two different Mimics, one virtual Mimic and one physical Mimic. The physical Mimic is in the sinkhole, while the virtual Mimic is in a sense free and controls different parts of the Pizzaplex like the elevators. If If this is true, why would the virtual mimic cut the elevator and he would have no reason to trick Cassie once more? But finally, what about the captions? Well, I think this is a pretty simple answer. It's just simply interference with the connection. We see something very similar when Cassie uses the first elevator to go down to the sinkhole, where we hear the distorted music cut in and out. So it would make sense that Gregory's microphone would cut out as the elevator went higher, which is why we heard the microphone interference. So this wasn't two Gregorys talking at the same time, it was just interference with the microphone. And overall, Gregory's actions match his actions in Security Breach. He destroyed all of the animatronics willingly just so he could upgrade Freddy, and he does all of this against Freddy's wishes. He isn't necessarily trying to survive in these moments, and he's just destroying them. So is it really that hard to believe that he would betray Cassie to ensure the mimic doesn't escape? There's even more evidence that I haven't discussed that comes from the GGY story from the Tales from the Pizzaplex novels, but I'll save that for another video. So it just doesn't seem that out of character for him, and using all of the evidence I discussed, I think we can prove that Gregory was the one who cut the elevator. So with all that said, because the last segment is entirely new dialogue, because it's not confirmed that the mimic can control the elevators, and because of Gregory's actions in Security Breach, I think it's safe to say that Gregory did betray Cassie in Five Nights at Freddy's ruin. Next, let's move on to the Scooper ending and how this ending connects to one of the franchise's most crucial games, Five Nights at Freddy's Sister Location. First, let's go over a quick recap of what we saw in the FNAF Ruin scooping ending. In order to unlock this ending while being chased by the mimic, you need to ignore Gregory's directions and go through a specific set of doors. And the only way to unlock these doors is by using hidden camera stations throughout the game. When opening all of the doors and when running through all of the rooms, in the very last room there's a red button that will activate this ending. After pressing it, the mimic will then run into the room while trying to capture you, and the scooper then scoops the mimic out of his costume, presumably destroying him. And with that, the scooper ending, or what is also known as the good ending, fades to the credits. Now there are a couple of important things to note with this ending, with the first being the fact that the mimic wears a lion costume throughout the entire ending. With all the other endings, the mimic's design stays the same, as we only see the lion costume in the room where he's revealed, so it's obvious the costume has some importance to the ending. In the books, we learn of different costumes that the mimic wears, so maybe this is just another way of connecting the books to the games. But moving on to the scooper and the main focus of this video, it's important to note that this is not the same scooper as the one we saw in FNAF Sister Location. When looking at their designs, they're not that similar at all. The scooper from Ruin looks much more advanced and modern compared to the one in Sister Location. It has a much simpler design, and even when comparing the blueprints to the Ruin scooper, there's still a big difference. Also, when comparing the rooms themselves, there's a big difference with the one from Ruin having a door in between the windows while the one from Sister Location doesn't. The sizes and colors of the room are also drastically different. Besides the scooper itself, there also just isn't any other hints or Easter eggs to Sister Location, which again leads me to believe this is a different room and scooper. Even if it was the same exact machine, that means that the Sister Location bunker would be right under the FNAF 6 pizzeria, which is right under the Pizzaplex. Although this would be a cool and unique idea, I don't think it's possible when considering everything we know about the underground bunker and where it was located, so again, these two scoopers are different. So what exactly did the scooper from Ruin do to the mimic? Well, as the name suggests, it scooped the insides of the lion costume, which was the mimic itself. We saw the exact same thing happen in FNAF Sister Location when the Funtime animatronics had their insides scooped out, which were their endoskeletons, and it's these endoskeletons that morphed together to create the new animatronic Ennard. We also see Michael's insides be scooped out so Ennard could use his body to escape the underground bunker. But if the mimic itself was scooped, then where is he? We only see the empty suit before the ending fades to the credits, and again, it seems like the mimic just disappeared. But I think this was intentional so they could hide what actually happened to the mimic. In Sister Location, although the Funtime animatronics were scooped, this didn't necessarily destroy them. They were still functional and could move around, which allowed them to morph into Ennard. Now this could have been because they were somehow still possessed by a child's soul, or it could have been because of Remnant, but I think we see this exact same thing happen with the mimic, just with agony. Agony is a substance that is fueled purely by hatred, sadness, anger, and the bad memories infused with one's soul. And in the books, we learn that the agony from the mimic's creator when he beat the mimic until he was almost destroyed is what caused him to become possessed. And I think it's the same agony that is still alive and present after the mimic was scooped, which again would allow him to move freely as this pile of animatronic parts. But where would this pile of animatronic parts go, and what would he do? Or more specifically, who would he go to? Who else in the entire franchise was made as a prominent villain in the new games, and they even showed up in Ruin as a small Easter egg. Of course, this is the Blob. When going down to the abandoned pizzeria, the Blob can be seen retracting itself into a wall, meaning he's still somewhere present in the pizzaplex. So what if this pile of animatronic parts, which is the Mimic, morphs with the Blob, which would create a new animatronic fueled on even more agony? It's assumed that the Blob is fueled by agony from the dead children's souls, so we can only imagine this would intensify if the Mimic somehow found it and again morph with it. This would then set up the main villain in the next project that would take place after Ruin. But you may be thinking that the Scooper ending isn't canon in Ruin. The bad ending is canon where Cassie escapes the Mimic, but she's ultimately betrayed by Gregory. But it's never actually been confirmed which one of these endings is canon, and it could be very well that the Scooper ending is canon and not the bad ending. When Security Breach was released, for the longest time it was believed that the Burn Trap ending was canon. It wasn't disproven until Ruin was released, when it was revealed that the Princess Quest ending was actually canon, and again not the Burn Trap ending. So something similar could happen with this ending, and even if it turns out that it isn't canon, I'm sure they can still find a way to mention the scooping room and the lion costume. Since they seem crucial to the Mimic and to the future Fnaf, we can assume it's just a matter of time before we see them in a future Fnaf project. So with all that said, the scooping room in Five Nights at Freddy's Ruin is different from the scooping room in FNAF's Central Location, and the scooping room might reveal to us the next villain in the Fnaf franchise. The Mimic would now be a pile of animatronic parts, and it still has to be somewhere in the pizzaplex, so what if he morphed with the Blob, who is also in the pizzaplex, creating a new animatronic? Finally, let's solve the sad ending of Five Nights at Freddy's Ruin and why it's one of the most heartbreaking endings from the franchise. For a quick recap of this ending plays out like any of the other endings as the Mimic begins to chase you. But instead of listening to Gregory's directions on how to escape the Mimic, if you go left on one of the turns instead of right, you will find a cardboard cutout of Fredbear. And when getting close to the cardboard cutout, you have the option of using the Vanny mask, and when using it, the sad ending is unlocked. Here, the Vanny mask will display a virtual simulation of Vanessa, Gregory, and Helpy outside of the pizzaplex on a hillside telling Cassie that she found them. All we hear is Cassie's panic breathing while the ending fades to the credits. Now, this is a straightforward ending compared to the last two endings. It's Cassie losing, it's Cassie failing to escape the Mimic and reaching Gregory, it's the Vanny mask having to make a fake reality for Cassie where she wins and is able to escape. It's just a sad ending where Cassie loses, and compared to many other endings from the FNAF franchise, it's just straightforward, and this makes it even sadder. Now, there are a few things to point out with this ending, with the first being that the Fredbear cutout is what activates this ending, but why Fredbear? Well, it's been heavily theorized that this cutout was a tease for a new project or game centered around Fredbear's family diner or this time period. And with the announcement of FNAF's Secret of the Mimic, now we know this is true. We know Secret of the Mimic will take place in 1979, and it's now the earliest game in the timeline, with it taking place 4 years before Five Nights at Freddy's 4, so what if this Fredbear cutout was setting up or a reference to Secret of the Mimic? But looking at the virtual simulation, it's worth pointing out how we see Vanessa on the hillside with Gregory, meaning she is still working with him, and it can be assumed that she's in charge of any kind of task. We know that Gregory visited the sinkhole after Security Breach, as we can find his backpack in the room where the Mimic is revealed, but this ending confirms that he wasn't alone, as it's likely that Vanessa went with him and that she made the decision to even go down there. And it's also likely that Vanessa is the friend that Gregory refers to many times in Ruin. Now, I think it's pretty clear that the ending is not canon, as if it was, there wouldn't be much of a story to be told afterwards. With the other two endings, there's still opportunity to either tell a story about Cassie or the Mimic, and in the case of the bad ending, there's a chance to tell a story about both of these characters. But with this ending, it's just assumed that the Mimic captures Cassie, which also means that the Mimic would not have a way to escape without her, so again, nothing could be continued with this ending. And because it's so straightforward, there isn't much to solve. The only real mystery was the cardboard cutout, but with that setting up the Secret of the Mimic, the sad ending has essentially been solved. But with all that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video on my solutions to 3 of the biggest mysteries from the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise. So what do you guys think? Make sure to comment down below any thoughts or theories. So make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and thank you guys so much for watching.